Hey, with your evening story channel, I post new interesting stories every day. Subscribe and click the bell to not miss it. A rich man took a pregnant convict as a nurse for her mother, and when he decided to check, he left the keys to the safe and was stunned. Michael was a successful businessman for a reason. He always made only balanced and well-considered decisions. It was that very rare case where subordinates genuinely loved their boss and never crossed him. And receiving a consistently high salary, employees gave their best, and not sit their pants in the office. And if Michael's business was more or less normal, his home affairs left much to be desired. Look, Ethan, don't you know a nurse? Or someone with a medical degree? Someone could give you a shot, an IV and stuff like that. I've had a lot on my mind. I'm about to open a homeless shelter. And then there's the visit to the orphanage with the presidents. Michael asked his deputy one day. He knew Ethan's opinion, but he still hoped it would change. Know where I am and where I've been sitting. You should spend more time with your family. After all, you have one mother, and you're all with your rehabilitation centers for vagrants and orphanages. It's Sisyphean labor. I've heard of it. No matter how much you help those poor bastards on the streets, there won't be any less. And only a few will take their heads in their pants, and most will continue to wander and beg. Go to a recruitment agency, let them find you what you need, Ethan replied. Yeah, I've already done that, but it's no use. No one can stay with my mom for more than a week. It doesn't seem to be a bad case. The doctor says that the chances of recovery are very high. But Mom's temper was very difficult before, and now it's become unbearable. That's why caregivers don't stick around for orphanages and homeless centers. You're wrong. In fact, if you follow your logic, there is no need to help people. It's easier to let things go and see what happens. But it's just not for me. I myself grew up without a father, and I know what poverty is. Clothes before ours and after our cousins. It's also very painful to see how your peers, flies in the school canteen buns with tea, and you got in your pocket only a dedicated rusk given by Mom. By the boss's unusual tone. Ethan realized that he had hurt his feelings and hurried to turn the conversation in another direction. Deep down, he thought Michael was strange, having such money and opportunities to use public transportation, and does not want to have a car with a private driver. He says that it is more convenient for him to be an ordinary citizen closer and not feel like a representative of the elite. Yeah, he's crazy, but he's lucky. What kind of deals did he grumble about? It's in the economics textbook, but he's giving the lion's share of his profits to charity. What a local Robin Hood. No family, no kids, and yet he's still at it. Recently, behind the office, I fenced off a plot of land with a net and made a place for feeding stray dogs. As soon as they get hungry, they start howling. Can you imagine what will happen next? A traveling zoo. Ethan was talking at his wife's dinner. If he had his will, he would have built a huge business center and made so much money that it could be pickled in jars like cucumbers for the winter. But Michael was the first violin in the office, and only in his hands were all the levers of power and control. The businessman had his own views on life and did not chase the generally accepted norms and stereotypes. I used the services of urban transportation. The colleague literally rested his soul. At such moments, he again felt like an eternally hungry student, looking for a place to earn 100 more. Today, leaving the office, he got on the bus and took his favorite seat by the window. Passengers looked in surprise at the well-dressed man, whose appearance gave him away as a successful businessman. What was he doing here? There are no foreign cars like him, and there's a bus here, the driver thought with surprise. But Michael had not been interested in the opinion of others for a long time. He liked to look out the window and watch the passers-by hurrying about their business, turning the town into a kind of anthill. Suddenly, at one of the stops, a girl entered the cabin, who was struggling to climb the stairs, holding her hands on her voluminous belly. Since there were no free seats, Michael was already prepared to give her his. When the woman controller asked, "Are you going to pay for the fare, my dear, or will you stand in the aisle?" Modestly, after all, not an icon to admire you. The stranger was embarrassed and put her hand in her pocket. By some elusive sixth sense, Michael realized that she had no money on her. She looked anxiously at the contents of the pocket, grieved more and more. At that moment, Michael stood up, and the checker was the first to approach. "Here you go. You see, a girl is just not herself. It's stuffy on the bus, and she's in a position." The stranger's cheeks flushed when she realized that this respectable man had just saved her from embarrassment. The controllers were not shabby and quickly realized what was going on. She didn't make a fuss and just took the money from the businessman's hands. And she realized that this well-dressed man could cause her a lot of problems if she wanted. So she'd better pay the fare. They're not puppies, that's the end of it. "Thank you. I appreciate it," the stranger whispered. "Oh, come on. I didn't do anything special. Why don't you take my seat? There's an open window and it'll be much easier to breathe. I'll stand, it's good for me. I've been in the office all day. Now I'm rushing home to my mom. She's sick, she doesn't want to be treated. I'm hiring, and she's kicking them out. It's a miracle." That's all Michael replied. The Savior's last phrase alerted the girl her name was Nancy. Until 2 years ago, she had worked as a nurse in the surgical ward. She didn't like the job, but the head of the department literally kept her on her toes with his endless complaints. And then Michael suddenly turned from anger to mercy and offered Nancy a chance to rehabilitate herself. And there was only one thing to do: take scarce medication to a patient's home. Nancy ran the errands once, then another, and then a third. The naive girl knew she was doing something not quite right, but she couldn't resist the head of the department. And who was she anyway? An orphan who grew up in an orphanage. And here's the head of the surgical department, a respected man in the city and a talented doctor. This went on for about a month, after which Nancy was stopped in the street by 2 plainclothes policemen and demanded to see the contents of her purse. Nancy understood everything. Tears flowed from her eyes. But tears are notoriously unbelievable. Not only the capital, but all other cities too. At the trial, the head of the surgical department was a witness and quite expectedly accused Nancy of all mortal sins. That's how she ended up in the walls of the women's colony. To say that life behind barbed wire was hard for Nancy would be to say nothing. Mother Bunny's recidivists did not give the former nurse rest, humiliating her and subordinating her to their will. This continued until the doctor at the local infirmary took her on as a nurse. Benjamin was quite a nice man who immediately took a liking to the pretty Sorota. Surrounding Nancy with attention and care, he quickly won her favor and won her heart. Whispering to Nancy of love through the long nights. The only thing Benjamin was silent about was that he was the son-in-law of the warden of the colony. Of course, there was no hiding the truth. And Nancy's connection with the prison doctor was soon discovered by someone for whom the information was worth its weight in gold. The chief didn't want to wipe his son-in-law clean. Well, the man had a fling, that's the way it is. But on the other hand, the impudent man should have been punished. So the next day, Benjamin was transferred to another colony, where in summer, the mosquitoes were the size of the sparrows, and bears came to visit at all hours of the day. But it was Nancy who felt the worst. Benjamin had sneakily deceived her and used her for his own purposes. Not only that, he kept quiet about the fact that he was married. He'd embarrassed her for the whole colony. And when Nancy found out she was pregnant, she didn't want to live at all. One of the recidivists calmed her down almost maternally. "What are you doing, you fool? The doctor gave you a present. Now you're on parole, you understand. We don't give birth in the penitentiary, and it's too much trouble to take you somewhere else. And then we'll have to take care of your kids. So get ready to go free." Nancy didn't believe it at first, but the woman's words were prophetic. She was indeed granted parole after 6 months of pregnancy. And 3 days later, Nancy found herself in her hometown. whereas she was completely unneeded. So when Nancy heard that Michael needed a caregiver, she jumped at the idea. Why don't I give it a try? I used to be a nurse, but then I went, how shall I put it, to prison. But don't think I'm not a criminal, I was set up. But it doesn't matter now, Michael thought for a moment. To be honest, he liked her honesty and adequate perception of reality. Michael didn't even doubt her medical abilities. But would Mom like her? Miranda was a woman with a temper, and here she was a nurse with a camp background. Whatever. Nancy sensed Michael's hesitation, but she didn't insist. Well, no means no. They'll find something else. But Nancy was wrong in her predictions. Michael not only offered to be a nurse, but insisted that she live in their house. What's the point of going back and forth? There's plenty of room in the house for everyone. I don't keep servants. I prefer to do things on my own, but I can't do without a nurse. Nancy smiled and gladly accepted the offer. Half an hour later, they were already sitting in the living room across from Miranda, leaning on her wand. Who's that? The new nurse. Aren't there any others, son? She's got a potbelly. You've got to work out who's going to help who. What if she goes into labor? What am I, a midwife or something? On call, the landlady asked. Neither of them blushed to the roots of their hair from embarrassment. She had never been so embarrassed in her life. Fortunately, Michael quickly joined the conversation. Mom, Nancy, she's a nurse, you know. Worked in surgery, which means something, yeah. Miranda puckered her lips but still pouted a little. Okay, we'll see what kind of nurse you are. But if I find out you're cheating in the kitchen, I'll kick you out. Nancy nervously and involuntarily touched her hand to her round belly. The baby was pushing, and clearly wanted to stand up for his mom. Hush, hush. My protector. It's okay, smiled and whispered Nancy. At that moment, Michael's heart ached. He had long dreamed of a family of children. But something always got in the way. In fact, Michael had never had enough time. Then preparing gifts for small orphans or repairing the gym. All this required not only funds, but also a lot of strength, attention. And for Nancy, a new life began. Miranda turned out to be a very troublesome patient who didn't want to be treated and blamed everyone but herself. She even brought Nancy to tears a couple of times, which upset Michael, who thought that the new nurse would run away from them at the same hour. But Nancy proved to be a tough nut to crack. Living in an orphanage, working in surgery, and being in a women's colony had tempered her character and made her stronger. After a week with Miranda, Nancy realized that she could continue to work. The main thing was that her health would allow it. Yet, the baby didn't kick too much, and then the unexpected happened. Miranda happened to see the release certificate falling out of Nancy's purse. Who have you brought me, son? That's an ex-convict. She's about to be taken out of the house, the last of it, and the nurse will let you in. What about it? She's got a criminal streak in her. My mom, Nancy, she worked in surgery, but she did time for embezzlement, which they framed her for. You know, it's not the same thing at all, objected the son. What about framed? When I worked as a store clerk when I was young, one of our people also said that she was framed, that we left the key to the cash register on the counter and followed it. So she opened it and the money was stolen. So much for the challenge. It had to be done in a way that Miranda would surely answer. At that moment, Michael suddenly realized that there was a sense in his mother's words that it could really be a test. I'll leave the keys to the safe and watch for the next room. At that moment, Nancy had no idea what was being planned against her. By leaving the keys in the most visible place, Michael locked himself in the room opposite, leaving a small slit for surveillance. Of course, he wasn't hoping for a quick result and was growing increasingly disappointed in the success of his scheme. But when Nancy took the keys in her hand, the businessman visibly tensed. Well, they opened the safe, and there was money in there, family jewelry, documents. As if mesmerized, she walked toward the safe. She couldn't understand what it was that drew her to the rich man's treasury. And even the always restless baby suddenly froze, stopped, kicking and pushing his mother's tummy with his legs. In fact, she was so eager to open the safe to see what was inside. She wasn't going to take anything from it at all. But wanting to see other people's secrets from the outside was akin to an obsession. Nancy turned the key 2 turns, and then there was a quiet click, and the door opened quietly. Before Nancy's eyes appeared huge stacks of bank-wrapped money and jewelry in a jewelry box. But it wasn't that caught her attention at all. It was the picture of Michael's late father. The thing was, she'd seen it before. Not only that, but she had one just like it herself. Nancy had been found at the train station when she was 4 years old, and then given to an orphanage. She stood crying and clutching the man's picture in her hands. I've a stated agonizing recollection. Nancy was brought out by the triumphant voice Miranda had created behind her back. But what a thief! I recognized you right away, didn't I? Nancy turned around and saw Michael with her mother. Where did you get this picture? I have one just like it. Do you understand? You can fire me. Take away my paycheck for being a duo. But who is this man? I was found at the train station with his picture in my hand. 23 years ago, she asked me. Michael shifted his gaze to his mother and was involuntarily surprised at the pallor of her face. Tears sprang from Miranda's eyes. This is my late husband, Michael's father. We divorced him almost immediately after we were married. That marriage was a mistake. He was always drawn to cards and gambling. Sometimes his pockets were bursting at the seams with money, and sometimes we couldn't scrape together a penny for bread. I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. He didn't want to get a good divorce and demanded one of the children as a reconciliation. I'll take care of my daughter, my son. And if you want, we can exchange. I was a fool, so I agreed. I haven't seen my daughter since, but then I heard rumors that his creditors took him away. I had to raise money for the funeral, too. So what does that mean? Nancy and I are brother and sister, Michael asked in surprise. Miranda was having trouble admitting it. Yes, son. When I first saw her, I thought of her husband's profile. So I went off on Nancy. I was rude. I'm sorry, my daughter. Nancy's lips quivered and tears came to her eyes. Put her arms around her mother. She pressed her whole body against her and cried softly. Michael stood there and could not believe his eyes. How could he have known that by taking in a former prisoner, he would find his own sister? Of course not. Nor did Miranda know it, from whose soul was now a great weight lifted. She had lived for so many years with a sense of guilt that all her illnesses were just from that. But now that Miranda had a daughter in her life, she had a taste of life again. After all, she was soon to become a grandmother and Michael a favorite uncle. If you like the story, please support me with a thumbs up button. And in order not to miss new interesting stories when subscribing, click the bell. Health to you and all the best.